In 1854, 6 men exhumed the churchyard graves behind St. Simeon's chapel, not by permission, but out of dread. What they found were coffins sealed in wax, lined with bloodless linens, and no bodies. In one box, a bundle of teeth. In another, a porcelain doll with real human hair. A third held a ledger bound in skin. No names inside, only symbols, and a phrase repeated over and over. What is buried will speak again. By sunrise, the 6 were missing. The town said cholera. The bishop said silence. But the bell rang anyway, and the graves were filled again before noon. This isn't about what they found. It's about what was always waiting to be uncovered. Sulphur Ridge, Kentucky, 1842. A forgotten parish built between dead coal veins and wetter things that never stayed buried. No trains, no doctors, just tobacco barns, clapboard houses, and a red brick church that cast a longer shadow than it should have. That was St. Simeon's, the Church of the Falling Word. It rang its bell 3 times a day, dawn, noon, and dusk. Dusk was always the loudest. The Reverend there was Abram Kestrel, slender, soft-voiced, hands like candle smoke. He claimed to be from Savannah, but no one in town remembered him arriving. He just began preaching one Sunday in late spring, and by that night he had keys to the chapel and burial rights to the land behind it. From 1842 to 1856, 152 souls were buried by Reverend Kestrel. But no families were allowed at the funerals. The coffins were always closed. Sometimes you could hear the nails being driven in before sunrise. Sometimes the ground steamed, even in frost. The town said nothing, but the dogs wouldn't go near the graves. This story starts when Isaac Thorne came home from Georgia with a foreign bride, pale, silent, wrapped in blue silks, never seen without gloves. They brought with them a steel lockbox and a wooden icon carve, and with symbols no one could read. His mother wept when she saw it. By the second Sunday, Reverend Kestrel paid them a visit. By the third, Isaac was digging graves in his sleep. That's when the first empty coffin was buried. That's when the counting began. Because here's the truth. Not every grave in America was meant to hold the dead. Some were meant to bind them, and others to feed them. Subscribe if you haven't yet. This story changes what we think we know about American soil. Which state are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. This isn't local. It's systemic. It's spiritual. And it starts here. The morning of Isaac Thorne's final Sunday began with the sound of iron tapping stone. He had been outside since dusk, sleepless again, his boots sunk deep in cemetery loam. He wasn't digging up, not anymore. He was measuring. 4 paces north, 6 east. Mark. Move on. His wife watched from the upper window, face pale behind veil glass, her hands hidden in those same kid-skin gloves. She hadn't spoken in nearly a week. Not to the neighbors, not to Isaac. Not even during service where she stood silent in the front pew, lips stitched tight like she was holding back something too heavy for her throat. That Sunday, Reverend Kestrel delivered a sermon that never ended. His voice was softer than usual, less fire, more lullaby. He spoke of thresholds, of blood as the signature of inheritance, and of the body as a vault. To be saved, he said, you must surrender the key and become the lock. The congregation didn't flinch. They never did. Half had been born under his ministry. The other half buried someone through it. Behind the chapel, among the tilting tombstones and leaning oaks, a new hole yawned open. It hadn't been dug by hand. The soil wasn't displaced. It was collapsed, like something underneath had clawed its way up, then changed its mind. Sheriff Malcolm Judd was the first to step down into it. He returned pale, shaking, and wouldn't say what he saw. He stopped attending church after that. A week later, his youngest boy, Eli, vanished while walking to Sunday school. His shoes were found 30 yards from the hole. The Reverend said nothing. But the bell rang late that night. Once, slowly, deep. No search was ordered. Isaac, meanwhile, grew thinner. He spoke of dreams, doorless rooms, spines with no bodies, a sound like chains dragged across stone in the belly of the earth. His journals, later found by the town clerk, described his bride as unburned by light, untouched by decay, mothered by something older than Genesis. She had taken to walking the perimeter of the chapel each night, humming a tune no one recognized, pressing her gloved hands against the red bricks one by one, like reading Braille etched into stone. And then the coffins started appearing. Unannounced. Delivered by wagon at dawn, left on the chapel steps. No names, no marks, no deaths reported. Just coffins, small ones, child-sized, 14 of them in 7 days. Reverend Kestrel said it was a kindness. "These are vessels reclaimed," he told the townspeople, "not from death but from misuse. We bury what should not have lived so that we may rise." No one questioned him. No one ever did. Except one. Sister Evelyn Marrow, a midwife, an herbalist, and the last woman in Sulphur Ridge who still remembered when the church belonged to someone else. She knew something ancient had been awakened. Not summoned, inherited. And as she wrote to her cousin in Charleston, "What they call faith here is closer to farming. But they're not growing crops. They're growing silence. And it's nearly ripe." Sister Evelyn Marrow didn't walk. She moved, gliding with the steadiness of someone who feared nothing but wasted time. Her cottage sat just outside the church's reach, beyond the tree line, where the fog didn't settle and the crows refused to perch. She had once delivered half the children in Sulphur Ridge, until Reverend Kestrel began discouraging home births. "You bring pain into holy space," he told her once, "but pain without offering is just noise." She never returned to his chapel again. But she watched. And in 1847, she began to record the names of every child born in town, and every child buried. The numbers never matched. That spring, the ground grew warm too early. The creek frothed with a thick yellow scum. Cattle miscarried. 3 of the oldest men in town, war veterans, widowers, men who remembered the church before Kestrel, were found dead in their beds, hands frozen into claws, mouths agape, eyes burned white. Kestrel called them natural passings. He buried them the same day, behind the church. Sister Evelyn, unconvinced, visited the graveyard that evening. But she didn't bring flowers. She brought iron nails and a crow's foot. Her grandmother had taught her the signs. And there it was, carved into the soil by the veterans' graves. A triangle split down the center, 3 dots above, 1 dot below. Not Christian, not tribal, older. She whispered a phrase she had not spoken in 20 years, something she learned from a gullah healer when she was just a girl. And the wind stopped, dead still. Then the chapel bell rang, once, just once, but the air bent around it like glass under pressure. The next morning, Evelyn visited Isaac Thorne. He looked worse than ever, eyes sunken, skin dry and ashen, fingers trembling around his coffee cup like he couldn't remember how to hold it. His bride did not come downstairs. Evelyn asked to see her. Isaac refused. "I think," he muttered, "she's dreaming with her eyes open now." He showed her the box, the one they brought from Georgia. It was sealed, heavy, and warm to the touch. Evelyn asked what was inside. Isaac said, "A promise. One I didn't make, but must fulfill. Before she left, she pressed a small vial of rowan oil into his palm and whispered, "There's no such thing as inherited salvation, only inherited debt." Later that night, the church lit its windows with greenish candles. The bell rang 7 times at midnight. And in the field behind the chapel, 12 men in black suits stood in a ring around a fireless pit. The moon was bright, but their shadows were too long and bent at unnatural angles. They held hands. They chanted something low and wrong, and inside the chapel something moved behind the pulpit. Something bigger than a man. They called themselves the Custodians of the Falling Word. 12 men sworn not to protect the church, but to prepare it. Bankers, land surveyors, a deputy judge, a physician with no patience, all dressed alike in black wool, starched collars, and gloves too tight for labor. They didn't speak in public. They didn't age in public, and their names were never spoken from the pulpit. But if someone disappeared, they always arrived first. They were there the night Isaac Thorne vanished. The story told to townsfolk was simple. Grief claimed him. That's all. The church rang the dusk bell, as it did for all passings. His bride remained behind the glass of the second-story window, still veiled, still watching. But the night before his disappearance, Isaac visited Sister Evelyn again. This time he was bleeding, from the eyes, the ears, and a puncture wound above his heart that pulsed instead of bled. "It's waking up," he whispered. She sat him down, made tea, anointed his palms in salt and yarrow. But he couldn't sit still. He clutched at the floorboards like they were trying to pull him through. "It wants what it was promised," he muttered, his voice shredded raw. "It thinks I'm just the throat." Then he coughed up something hard. It hit the floor with a sound like wet iron, a molar, polished flat, inscribed with the same 3-dot symbol Evelyn had seen by the graves. She burned it that night in her stove. The smoke turned violet. Her cat died the next morning. The next day, the town was quiet. Even the birds had gone. Isaac's house was empty. No bride, no trunk, no furniture. Only a single, neatly folded robe on the floor, stitched in scarlet thread down the spine. It bore a message. "The word descends in flesh and shall rise in hollow." Evelyn took it to the sheriff. Sheriff Judd refused to look at it. "I ain't lost a boy, Miss Marrow," he said, "but I wait. If I pry this church open, my advice, pray louder than it listens." That night, the bell rang 8 times, a number never used in Christian rites, not for burial, not for baptism. 8 is a number for binding. And from that night on, no child under the age of 10 would speak inside the chapel, not even to scream. Meanwhile, Reverend Kestrel preached to fuller crowds than ever. His sermons became darker, but his voice sweeter. He told them the world was sick, not of sin but of memory, that they could be healed only by forgetting the old names. He said, "God is not a word. God is an echo, and echoes must be fed." He said, "You must unlearn your prayers," and they did. They forgot their grandmother's hymns, forgot how to bury their own dead, forgot how many coffins lay behind the chapel and how few were ever opened. But Evelyn remembered. She had seen it before, in a plantation chapel near Beaufort, years before the war. Same bell, same robes, same silence. She knew the signs, and she knew that time was running out. Sister Evelyn returned to the graveyard on the full moon of October 1851. The same night 3 children vanished from their beds without a trace, their windows open, their Bibles gone. The church bell rang once every hour from dusk until dawn, but no one admitted to hearing it. Only Evelyn wrote it down. She came with salt, rosemary, and a crowbar. The grave she chose was marked Infant Male, 4 days. No name, no date, just the Reverend's seal, a triangle with 3 stars. The soil was dry, brittle, easier to dig than it should have been. 12 minutes in, the crowbar hit iron. Not wood, iron. A blackened, riveted box. No hinges, no nails. Just a small cavity in the center, shaped like a human hand, but smaller. Not infant-sized, not human-sized at all. She didn't touch it. Instead, she poured the salt around the edge in a perfect circle, just like her grandmother taught her. Circle seals, iron binds, fire remembers. She etched those words into the lid with her knife, then covered the hole and left. She sent a letter to Charleston that night, to an old friend named Mother Delphia, an archivist of forbidden hymns and one of the last women known to have fled a red-robed church intact. The reply came in 3 days. It said only, "It is not a church. It is a vault. They are the lid. You must find the tongue." The next morning, the church's bell rope was found soaked in something slick and black. A child's shoe was nailed to the door, and Reverend Kestrel preached barefoot. He stood taller that day. His voice vibrated the rafters. He didn't speak from the Bible, but from a book wrapped in flayed leather, red and veined, like skin still remembering blood. The words were not English, not Latin, something with too much breath. The congregation didn't blink, didn't move. One woman smiled so wide her gums bled. Later that evening, Evelyn found a package on her doorstep, wrapped in linen. No note. Inside, one gloved hand. Her breath stopped. She recognized it. The stitching, the shape, the stillness. It was Isaac's bride, or part of her. The fingers twitched once, as if something had just been released. Evelyn buried it in her herb garden, salted the ground and sealed the door. But she couldn't sleep. Something scratched the walls from inside. That night, she dreamed of a staircase beneath the church, downward, endless, lit by tongues on fire. Children stood on every step, silent, skin waxy, eyes closed, palms outstretched, waiting. She woke, screaming, and that scream traveled. The next morning, the creek behind the church ran red. Not blood, dye, deep red ink, staining the rocks and fish. A message, written upstream on driftwood. "Speak the name and the lock unmakes." She understood. The church was never burying bodies. It was storing silence, preparing the land. And the coffins, they weren't for the dead. They were for the living, made empty first. The days grew colder, but no frost touched the churchyard. Birds migrated. Dogs refused to enter town. Every tree within 50 yards of St. Simeon's stopped blooming, their branches bone dry, as if winter had forgotten how to finish killing them. And then the coffins returned. 12 more, stacked outside the chapel doors. Smaller, narrower, some shaped more like boxes for instruments than for children. Each sealed, each marked only with that silent symbol, the 3 stars over the broken triangle. Sister Evelyn watched from the edge of the trees, heart ironclad, breath shallow. The custodians arrived within the hour, black coats, white gloves, expressionless. They carried the coffins inside with solemnity. Not reverence, no, more like compliance. Inside, the Reverend's voice echoed like water in a dry well. Every silence is an offering, every tongue a tether. What you do not speak cannot bind you. The door closed. Evelyn didn't move. She was waiting for the child who always came last. There was always one. This time it was Ruthie Bell, age 6, last seen 3 days earlier. Her mother said she'd wandered during a fever dream. Evelyn knew better. Sure enough, Ruthie appeared an hour later, barefoot, eyes clouded, following no one and nothing. She walked straight to the chapel steps and sat, waiting, smiling, humming a tune Evelyn hadn't heard in decades. A lullaby, a binding song. From the Sea Islands. It hit Evelyn like a falling clock. The original name of the tune wasn't English. It was Root Gullah, sung by mothers in secret circles to protect children from the Hollow Folk. Only the elders remembered it. Only the oldest roots knew. The church had not just adopted the rite. It had stolen it, warped it, fed it through generations until it became an infection masked as liturgy. And Ruthie was humming it backwards. That night, Evelyn B. returned home to find her doors open, her wards broken, salt disturbed. Her grandmother's Bible, the one bound in faded cowhide and filled with notations in 3 languages, gone. But something had been left in its place. A tongue, small, childlike, shriveled like leather, still twitching. It lay inside a silver offering plate, beneath a velvet cloth. Pinned to it was a note, written in ink the color of molasses. Speak not what was meant to be swallowed. Evelyn burned it with juniper and lye. The smoke turned green. Her chickens dropped dead by morning. It was then she knew. The church wasn't just sealing silence in coffins. It was feeding it to something deeper. Beneath the chapel, under the stones, the soil, the bones, something was listening. And worse, it was learning. The sermons weren't just ceremonies, they were scripts. Scripts designed to train the congregation how not to remember, how to forget on command. And the children, they were the carriers, not infected, inscribed. Living scrolls, emptied, encoded, buried alive in echo. Evelyn had to act. Before the harvest bell rang, before the final coffin was sealed, before the last child forgot how to scream, Evelyn rode to Briar's Hollow under moonless sky, lantern hooded, Bible wrapped in oilcloth and rope. She carried with her 3 things: a page torn from her grandmother's book of wards, a rusted key marked with the same triangle symbol, and the name of someone she had not dared speak in 27 years. Mother Delphia. She found her deep in the swamp chapel, where the trees lean like eavesdropping elders, and the air tastes like rust. The sanctuary was half collapsed, the pews rotted, the altar overgrown with moss and bitter root, but the flame in Delphia's hearth still burned blue. "I was wondering when you'd remember," Delphia said without turning. "I didn't forget," Evelyn replied. "I was trying to survive." Delphia poured dark tea and set down a bowl of salt. "Then you're already too late. Survival means you learn to breathe the same air. That thing in Sulphur Ridge? It's no longer a guest. It's a citizen." Evelyn told her everything. The empty coffins, the children's songs, the tongues, the triangle, the offerings. Delphia nodded like someone who'd watched the fire spread from a distance. "It's not the first time," she said. "They tried it near Natchez. Before that, in a ship off Charleston's coast. Same bell, same robes, same forgetting. They call themselves Custodians," Evelyn said. "They're jailers," Delphia corrected, "but the cell is you." She drew a diagram in ash on the table. The triangle, but broken 3 times, intersected with lines of verse written backward. They bind silence into children, use them as vaults, seal them in ritual. But that church, that red brick womb, it's not just keeping them in, it's keeping it out. Evelyn's voice cracked. "What is it?" Delphia hesitated, then whispered, the unsung. A name not meant to be spoken, but left like meat on the altar of history, forgotten so thoroughly that its hunger turned to shape. It feeds on abandoned names, on erased stories, on truths we weren't allowed to pass down. She handed Evelyn a bone charm and a folded map of Sulphur Ridge. But it was older. The map showed something beneath the church. Catacombs, spiraling downward like a serpent swallowing its tail. "It doesn't want silence," Delphia said. "It wants submission. And once the last child forgets their name, the gate opens." "Can I stop it?" Evelyn asked. Delphia shook her head. "You're not the one meant to, but you're the one still willing to try." On her ride back, Evelyn passed a field of scarecrows. But they weren't straw. They were suits. 12 black suits, arms raised to the sky, swaying in still air, each with a wax face and a lockbox nailed to its chest. A custodian's warning. She didn't stop. By the time she reached Sulphur Ridge, the bell was ringing non-stop. It hadn't rung like that since the War of 1812. And standing in front of the church now, beneath the bleeding moon, eyes shut, arms open, was Ruthie Bell, humming that backwards lullaby. One final verse left, one coffin remaining. Evelyn stood before the chapel gates, wind at her back like a breath held too long. The bell no longer rang, but now the silence pulsed. It had weight, shape, like a thing waiting to be let in. Ruthie Bell turned her veiled head slowly toward Evelyn. The girl's eyes were pupilless, white marbles behind cracked lids, but she smiled like she recognized her. The church doors opened without hands. Inside, candles lit in sequence, not from flame, but from within. Their light was black, burning inward, drawing shadows toward them. Evelyn stepped forward. The pews were full, every seat taken by a child. Silent, still, eyes closed, hands folded. Coffins lined the aisle, some open, some sealed. But none were empty. Inside each lay names, stitched into flesh, written on bone, carved into wax. Not bodies, identities, stored, sealed, discarded. At the altar stood Reverend Kestrel, arms open, eyes dark with something ancient, not possession, purpose. He smiled. "You've come to make noise," he said, "but this place is tuned." Evelyn reached into her cloak and pulled the bone charm Delphia gave her. It burned cold in her hand. "I'm not here to shout," she said. "I'm here to remember." The walls shuddered. Kestrel stepped back. "You've no right. You walked away. I survived." Her voice shook now. "And I brought a key." The charm began to hum. Behind her, the children stirred. One by one, their mouths opened. No sound, just exhalation. The first step in remembering, breath. Kestrel bared his teeth. "You're too late. The lock is spoken. The word has fallen." Evelyn's eyes burned, but she did not flinch. She raised the charm high and spoke the name Delphia warned her never to say. Anath Sarat. The bell above screamed, not rang. Screamed. The pews caught fire. The walls cracked like eggshells. The children's voices returned in a wave, not scree. Sees, not cries. Names. Their own names. Ruthie Bell was the last to speak hers. And with that, the final coffin cracked open. Inside, a mouth. Only a mouth. Stitched across the width of a man's chest, rimmed in brass and ink. It breathed in. Then it spoke back. Evelyn dropped to her knees. She was too late. The unsung had learned a name, not hers, not the children's. Yours. Yes, you. You who've listened this far, watched this long. You who know now what they tried to bury. The story has found you. So now you must choose. Comment below twice, yes, twice, with this phrase to seal your memory and mark your resistance. I will not be emptied. Do it once for your voice. Do it again for your lineage. Because this story is no longer locked in 1851. It's under your feet. It's waiting in your walls. And if you forget this name, this truth, the silence will take its place. Type it now. Before your name begins to fade. The chapel collapsed before dawn. Locals said it was the storm, a sudden gust, a shift in the clay, the wrath of God. But no storm had come. The skies were clear, and there was no wind in the graveyard that morning, just steam, and the sound of flies circling something that couldn't rot. Evelyn was found in the center of the wreckage, kneeling beside the altar, covered in ash and dried wax. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Not blank, no. Listening, whispering names, one after another, as if reading a list no one else could see. The children were safe. They'd been found in the field at sunrise, 14 of them, walking in a circle around the final open coffin, singing. Not backwards this time. They were remembering. But the cost was not paid in full. Because deep beneath the rubble, under centuries of layered soil and doctrine, something had shifted. The pit beneath the pulpit had cracked, and something inside it had breathed for the first time in generations. Not the unsung itself, but its envoy. It crawled out through the tunnel behind the sacristy, dragging a waxed leather satchel and the tongue of Ruthie Bell's twin brother, Jacob, who died in 1845, buried in silence, forgotten even by his mother. The custodians were gone. Vanished. Their homes stripped, records erased, the watchtower burned to its foundation. All that remained were their gloves, nailed in pairs to the barn doors of every household that had once tithed directly to the Reverend. The town entered a hush so deep it rang in the ears like a scream. No more sermons, no more bells, no more burials. The land was exhausted. But Evelyn was not finished. She left Sulphur Ridge that winter, travelled south, past Decatur, past Savannah, following river maps drawn not with ink, but with ash and salt. Her destination, the Morrow Line, a chain of forgotten sites, from slave chapel to sun, kinship, where echoes of the unsung had been heard but never understood. She carried with her the only surviving page from the Reverend's Red Gospel. The parchment smelled of myrrh and coal dust. It bore a single passage, "And the vaults shall open from below, not to release but to consume. And the faithful shall speak with mouths they did not make, and the flesh shall remember what the tongue forgets." That page was the final seal, one that must never be read aloud. But there were others who sought it, others who had waited. You see, Sulphur Ridge was not the first church to bury empty coffins, and it would not be the last. There were more vaults, more names, and worse, more children of the silence, now grown, married, holding office, wearing robes not of scarlet, but of gold. They do not speak of what they were made to forget, but they remember. They always remember. Evelyn's journey was not exile. It was preparation. Because to silence the unsung completely, one must descend deeper than memory, into blood, into binding, into the wound beneath America's holy ground. The wound beneath the church was not closed, It was covered, a scab stretched across centuries, stitched by sermons, sealed by ritual, masked in righteousness. But blood remembers. And someone was listening. Evelyn reached the Carolina Low Country in early 1852, her boots cracked, hands blackened from old wax and burning salt. She followed the waterways mapped by root workers and rice field hymns, places where words had once been sown instead of spoken. There, in the ruins of a sunken tabernacle built by freedmen and erased by a controlled fire, she met a boy named Zion. He was 10, born mute, but he could draw sounds. When Evelyn handed him a charred bone from Sulphur Ridge, he didn't flinch. He took charcoal and drew a symbol onto the wall. Not the triangle. Something older. A spiral devouring itself. Delphia had written of it in the forbidden margins. The spiral is not a door, but a throat. To stop the unsung, you must not kill the mouth. You must silence the echo it feeds on. Evelyn understood then. The unsung was not a single entity. It was a chorus. A convergence of voices long buried, not peacefully, but violently. Erased names, erased languages. The ones no longer spoken aloud became currency for the thing beneath the church, forgottenness as fuel. And every time the bells rang and no one wept, it grew stronger. Zion led Evelyn to a place called Crossroot, a plantation abandoned in 1793 after its entire family vanished overnight. There were no bodies, just open doors, bloody mirrors, and a single verse written backward across the floorboards. We fed it what we feared, and it made us holy. In the sugar barn, beneath a trapdoor choked with mold, they found the ledger vault. Hundreds of wax-sealed name tags, none longer than 4 letters, all handwritten in blood. Zion stared at one for a long time. Then he scratched it open. Theat, walls pulsed. A scream came, not from him, but into him, like something had been waiting centuries to fill a vessel. Evelyn grabbed him, forced a drop of salt under his tongue, and whispered a counterprayer in a language she hadn't spoken since she was a child. The scream stopped, but the voice stayed. That night, Zion dreamed in other people's memories. He drew what he saw. A boy, buried alive in a church crypt while robed men sang over his breath. A mother burned for humming the wrong lullaby. A congregation in white linen, reciting names as they slit their tongues and dropped them into offering bowls. The vault Evelyn found wasn't just a relic. It was a harvest. And Sulphur Ridge. It was only one field. Zion had unlocked something. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to hear the hum again. Low across the country, vibrating under floorboards, echoing in hymns that didn't quite sound like they used to. The unsung was stirring, and its choir was being built. One silence at a time. In the spring of 1853, church bells began ringing at the wrong hours across 5 southern counties. Midnight, 3:33 a.m. Noon, but only on overcast days. No pattern, no cause, no confession. Ministers claimed pranksters. Locals said wind. But in every town where the bells misrang, a child went silent. Not missing, just quiet. In the town of Ash Bramble, Georgia, a mother reported her daughter, age 9, stopped speaking after church. She hadn't cried, hadn't fainted, just placed a folded hymnal into her mother's hand and walked to her room. The cover bore no cross, only a wax seal. The broken triangle, inverted. No one in Ash Bramble had heard of Sulphur Ridge. But Sulphur Ridge had heard of them. The spiral was spreading. The unsung didn't travel like a beast. It didn't slither or fly. It echoed. It slipped into liturgy, lodged itself in half-sung verses, corrupted scripture one syllable at a time. Not to kill faith, but to invert it, hollow it out, repurpose belief into binding. Evelyn and Zion tracked the fractures through old underground channels, not the railroads of bodies, but of memory. Safe houses that held forbidden books, stories never written down, symbols etched behind bricks only freed hands could place. In one such place near Vicksburg, Evelyn uncovered what she'd feared most. A mirror sermon. Written in longhand by a preacher-turned-hollow named Pastor Toby Cranston, the sermon mimicked every word of the Gospel of John, but in perfect reversal, not just backward, inverted in meaning. Where John 1:1 said, "In the beginning was the Word," the mirror sermon read, "In the ending waits the silence, and the silence was with God, and the silence was God." That text was not meant to be read aloud. It was meant to be planted. Once spoken, it didn't just enter the air, it entered the listener. That's how the unsung traveled. Not by touch, not by blood, by speech, by the cracks in our own mouths. Evelyn made the mistake of reading one line. Zion stopped breathing, only for 9 seconds. But it was enough. When he woke, his voice had changed. It was deeper, wrong, echoed even in small rooms. He wept, but the tears ran up his face. Evelyn bound his throat in ash-charred linen and sealed it with rowan and wax. It worked, for now. But she knew the truth. Zion was no longer just a boy. He was a vessel, a ledger rewritten in flesh. And Evelyn? She was his witness. If she failed to keep his voice bound, he would become what Sulphur Ridge tried to build for generations, a living altar, one whose very breath fed the hollow. And the final ritual, it wasn't death. It was forgetting his name. Because once no one remembers who you were, you can be rewritten into anything, even the unsung. Evelyn tightened the binding, kissed his forehead, and whispered the phrase again. "I will not be emptied." They had 5 more vaults to find, and only one blood moon left before the spiral sealed forever. They reached the swamp town of Ebonlight just after the eclipse. Smoke hung over the cypress trees like gauze soaked in turpentine. Evelyn's hands were raw. Zion hadn't spoken since Vicksburg. Not a word, not a whisper. But he'd begun to write in his sleep. Names. Hundreds. Some crossed out, others circled. Many that had never been born. The church in Ebonlight had no name, no steeple. Just a tower of rotted boards wrapped in thornvine, with a crooked bell that hadn't rung in decades. But it was humming. The locals avoided it, said the land had gone deaf. And every week, a different elder in town forgot their child's name. Not just forgot, erased. Couldn't remember ever having one. The records burned. Photos turned blank. Bibles waterlogged with no sign of rain. The unsung had already come through here. But something had stopped it. Buried beneath the altar of that crooked tower was a stone too dark for granite, too smooth for nature. A tongue had been carved into its face, not human, not beast. And in its center, sealed in wax and bile, was a name. Zion Thorn. Evelyn's blood ran cold. "That's not yours," she whispered, pulling the boy back. But he walked forward anyway. Step by step, his bare feet silent. The boards creaked away from him like they feared what he carried. He knelt before the altar and placed his palm on the stone. Then, for the first time in 91 days, Zion spoke. Not a prayer, not a plea, but a command. "Wake." The bell above shattered. The trees around the church split, and below the floor it answered. The pit opened. Not dug, but revealed, as if the land had just blinked and decided to remember what it hid. A staircase spiraled down, wet with roots, lined in finger bones. Evelyn screamed his name. Not once. Not twice. 3 times. But Zion didn't stop. His voice deepened, echoed, not like before. This time it was his own voice, no longer borrowed, no longer fed. He had become the counterweight, the memory unforgotten, the flaw in the echo, and the unsung knew it. From the pit rose smoke, white, then violet, then black like grieving silk. It formed a face, then a mouth, but no eyes, only names. They poured out, whispered in tongues, Cherokee, Yoruba, Latin, Gullah, German, Lenape, all the names erased by conquest, by slaughter, by forced silence. This wasn't a demon. It was our forgetting made flesh. And now it wanted Zion's body, not to destroy it, to inhabit it. He was the last name not erased, the last vault still sealed. Evelyn stepped forward, holding the bone charm in her palm until it bled. She spoke the reversal rite, the one Delphia swore would kill both speaker and echo. But Zion turned to her, smiled, his smile, and said, "No more seals, no more vaults." Then he whispered his full name. Every syllable, even the ones he was never taught. The pit screamed. The altar cracked. And the unsung lost its shape. The spiral shattered. It didn't break like wood or stone. It unraveled, soundlessly, like a forgotten hymn being unsung by the universe itself, one syllable at a time. The black smoke collapsed into itself, folding in unnatural angles as if trying to escape its own reflection. Zion stood at the edge of the pit, eyes glowing not with possession, but remembrance. His voice, once borrowed, now rewrote the air around him. Evelyn wept, not in grief, but awe. She saw in him not a vessel, but a mirror, one that finally refused to lie. As the name finished pouring from his lips, the staircase crumbled. The altar split clean through, revealing a hollow spine of bones that were not human. Bones older than prayer, longer than time, coiled around a pulsing black organ. It beat once, then turned to ash. A burst of air flattened the trees surrounding Ebonlight. The tower collapsed, the bell shattered in a final wail that was not metal, but voices. Thousands, released. They sang. For the first time in over a century, the unsung sang back, not in language, in memory. Across 5 states, children awoke from sleep with the names of their ancestors on their tongues. Old graveyards bloomed, locked trunks popped open, walls bled family trees, photographs reappeared. The erased were remembered, but not everything healed. At the center of the collapse, where Zion stood, the earth began to sink. Slowly, deliberately. The final vault opening, not in ritual, but in sacrifice. He looked at Evelyn one last time. "I'm not what they made me," he whispered. "I know," she said. "You remember my name?" "I always will." Then he stepped into the hollow. Evelyn tried to stop him, but the earth would not allow it. It sealed around him like a mouth closing after communion. And in that silence, pure, ringing, eternal, the sky wept. Not rain, ash. Black petals of names once burned, now burned to the soil. Across the south, churches found wax seals melted. Baptismal fonts turned to stone. Red robes caught fire during prayer. In Charleston, a bishop collapsed at the pulpit, speaking only the words, "He woke it," before his tongue turned to salt. But something else changed. People remembered. Stories passed again between generations. Midwives sang lullabies with names older than the state lines. Bells rang at the right hours. And the children? They spoke, freely, loudly, with new names on their lips and old blood in their bones. Evelyn stayed in Ebonlight for the rest of her days. She never rebuilt the church. She planted trees in its ruins, one for each name Zion spoke. When she died, they say the ground didn't take her. It opened gently, like it had been waiting. And beneath her grave, carved in the roots of the oldest tree, was a phrase in a language no priest would ever admit to knowing. The word does not fall. It becomes seed. And Zion? He was never seen again. But on certain nights when the wind blows through Sulphur Ridge, you can still hear him. Humming. Washington County Historical Society receives a donation of 47 sealed documents from an anonymous estate sale in Sulphur Ridge. No names, no return address, just a note pinned to the bundle. Do not speak what sleeps, just file. But one intern, a girl named Lillian Price, did more than file. She opened the last envelope. Inside, a wax-sealed page bearing the inverted triangle, and a map. Not of Sulphur Ridge, but of the entire southeastern United States. 12 towns, 12 chapel sites, all marked with the same 3-dot insignia, all tied to churches no longer listed on state records. She traced their locations. Everyone had experienced unexplainable phenomena between 1839 and 1862. Disappearances, cholera with no source, outbreaks of hysterical silence among children, and in each, a reverend who died without a death certificate. Each church had its own Zion, its own vessel. But only Sulphur Ridge succeeded. Lillian tried reporting it to her supervisor. He took the files, locked them away. 2 weeks later, he was found hanging in the archives, eyes burnt white, mouth filled with salt. No foul play, just self-inflicted. The files were destroyed, or so they claimed. But Lillian made copies. She mailed them to 2 people, a Gullah Roots historian in Beaufort and a professor of comparative religion at Tulane. Both recipients vanished within the year, but their homes were found burned in the same exact pattern, spiral ash around a sealed Bible, wax handprint on the door. The spiral was active again. The Church of the Falling Word had not ended. It had evolved. No more red robes, no more country graveyards. Now, it dressed itself in suits, sat on boards, wrote policy, funded silent charities, taught mindfulness techniques that instructed people to forget rather than remember. The vaults were digital now, the tongues no longer cut but chinned. And the children. You've seen them. Eyes glazed, smiles perfect, speech rehearsed, knowing too much, feeling too little. They are not possessed. They are patterned. Zion's sacrifice hadn't stopped the unsung. It had slowed it, bound it, but only for as long as we remembered why he did it. And we've forgotten. The bells no longer ring in churches. They vibrate in notifications, in algorithmic tones, rituals of silence dressed as convenience. And deep in Sulphur Ridge, the church has been rebuilt, not as a chapel, as a museum. A historical site with no plaque, no birth records, no cemetery. They say it's a replica. But there is no record of it being funded, no public land purchase, no construction crew ever photographed on site. Yet there it stands, red brick, black bell, and 12 wax mannequins standing in the pews, dressed in 1850s suits. One is missing a hand. The front coffin is still open. Waiting for you. You think this story was old, But the real horror? It adapted, and it remembers you now. They reopened the Sulphur Ridge Memorial Chapel to the public in 2024. A preservation effort, they said, historical significance, educational tourism, but the real exhibit was never mentioned in the brochures. Beneath the chapel's floor, sealed behind a glass partition lit in pale blue, rests a single coffin. It's never been moved, never been opened. It bears no name, just a plaque. Vault 13, untouched, do not disturb. They tell visitors it's symbolic, a metaphor for the unknowns of rural faith history. But watch the tour guide's eyes when asked about it. They blink, too often, as if trying to remember what they've been told to forget. Inside that coffin is not a relic. It's not a body. It's a mirror. And if you stare too long into the glass above it, you'll see your reflection change, slowly, subtly, like it's listening. And in your chest, a heaviness begins. It doesn't hurt. Not yet. But it hums, just beneath your heartbeat. That's not drama. That's the story completing its circuit. Because if you've made it this far, then I need you to understand something. The final vault is not in the ground. It's in the audience. It's in the listener. It's in you. They didn't build the Church of the Falling Word to bury people. They built it to bind memory, to strip names, to store silence, to hide the parts of us that couldn't be broken any other way. And now that you've heard the story, now that you've spoken the symbolic phrase, I will not be emptied. Now that you've commented it twice, like I asked, you've opened your vault. But listen carefully. This is not a curse. This is a weapon. You are not infected. You are armed. Because remembering is resistance. Knowing is protection. Speaking is survival. Zion didn't fall. He planted himself. He became the tree under which silence cannot grow. And the coffin? It was never for him. It was for the next one. The next person who would hear the full tale, who would carry the names, who would keep the bell ringing. So here's what you must do. Never forget this name, Sulphur Ridge. Never erase the phrase, the word becomes seed. Never let a child be taught to be silent in the face of forgetting. And if you ever pass through Kentucky and see a red brick chapel with no windows, keep driving. Do not stop. Do not look at the mannequins in the pews. And above all, do not open the coffin. Because the unsung is still echoing. It has no shape of its own. It needs yours. And if you forget that for even one moment, if you doubt for even one heartbeat, it will write itself into your story. And the silence will begin again. The veil was never cloth, it was story. Woven from denial, stitched with tradition, dyed in red praise. And like all veils, it was never meant to hide the truth from you. It was meant to make you choose not to see it. But now, you've seen it. You heard the bells. You followed the names. You descended into the spiral. And there's something you need to understand before this ends. The unsung never wanted to destroy us. It wanted to become us. One erased name at a time. One broken memory. One sealed voice. It fed not on blood or flesh, but on forgetting. And that's why Zion mattered. That's why Evelyn fought. That's why 12 children in Sulphur Ridge were taught to hum backwards, and why every sermon was designed to sever history from spirit, tongue from truth, body from soul. Because silence is not the absence of sound, it is the erasure of memory. But now the memory lives in you. You remember the sermons. You remember the wax. You remember the vaults. And deep down, in a part of your spirit, no prayer has touched in years. You remember your name, not the one given, the true name, the one that echoes backwards in your dreams, the one whispered in secret when you were still made of light. Say it. Now. Say it silently if you must. Say it while you're alone. Say it while you're afraid. Because if you say it out loud, something will hear you. And if you don't, something else will. And it will try to claim that name, bend it, seal it, file it away in a coffin beneath another smiling preacher's chapel. But it won't work. Not this time. Because you are not empty. You were never a vault. You were never a silence waiting to be filled. You are echo and thunder. You are script and fire. And the unsung, it's running now. You can feel it. That hum in your walls, that flicker in your light, that bell in your head that rings at 3:33 a.m. It's not calling you, it's fleeing you. You're the last chapter it couldn't erase, the name it couldn't bury, the child it couldn't silence. And when you pass through this world, when you leave your mark on its soil, when your name is spoken one final time, it will not be with tears or bells or empty praise. It will be with a fire that sings, a hymn remembered, a tongue uncut, a coffin empty, and a voice, your voice, that echoes through every hollow this church ever dug, saying, "Not again." So now, close this story. Let the bells fall silent. Let the last candle dim. But before you go, look over your shoulder, right now. And if you see a red brick chapel with no windows, don't be afraid. Just smile. Because this time, it's you who remembers. And it's the unsung that has something to fear. Forever. The story is complete. Thank you for watching. Share this if you felt it in your bones. Now tell me one final time in the comments, "I will not be emptied," and let the vaults stay closed.